Okay, we are recording. I am Brandon Polite, professor and R. Lance Factor Endowed Chair of Philosophy at Knox College in Galesburg, Illinois. And I'm joined by Jay Miller, who's an associate professor of philosophy and chair of the Public Humanities program at Warren Wilson College in Asheville, North Carolina. Jay, thank you so much for joining me.
Well, thanks for having me, Brandon. I appreciate it.
Awesome. So we're talking about your paper, Irony in Earnest, Rethinking Hegel's Critique of Romantic Irony, which was recently published in Inquiry. And to get us started, you're dealing, as the subtitle indicates, with Hegel's critique of romantic irony. So I think the way to proceed is to A, get clear on what romantic irony is, and then B, what's Hegel think is wrong with it, and then we'll proceed from there. So, first question then, what's romantic irony as you're engaging with it in the paper?
Yeah, great. This debate, what's sometimes called, I think, partly erroneously called a debate, the Hegel versus the Romantics on irony. It's one of the infamous debates of the 19th century because in it, Hegel is just really, really nasty. I mean, at this point, Hegel has already kind of established himself as Germany's up and coming philosopher, but the Romantics kind of develop contemporaneously, and their departure becomes like really, really pronounced, particularly over this question of irony, right? And we can talk a little bit more about the background conditions of that, because what they're looking at as or they're responding to a kind of anti-enlightenment or post-enlightenment sentiment, a rejection to some extent of Kantian style rationalism, but they're doing it in very, very different ways. Hegel over here is talking about absolute knowing, right? This idea that we can kind of sort of conceptually grasp the world in its totality, right? And so like let's keep rationalism going, right? Like let's not stop and say that there are things in themselves that are unknowable. Let's envision that rationality is this all-encompassing thing. Whereas the Romantics say, well, hold on, let's go back and think about maybe other forms of knowledge. The aesthetic comes in a very, very heavy way. And I think that you can't really fully grasp what irony is without understanding that aesthetic approach that they take. I think we have to think of irony as a kind of a byproduct of thinking of the world aesthetically. I think it is for them a way of thinking of the world aesthetically. And so whereas Hegel is moving away from our artistic, aesthetic, mythological understanding to the world to something that's more sort of a kind of hyper rationalism, the Romantics are moving towards other ways of knowing, right? It's a kind of anti-foundationalist approach. And so irony comes in right around the turn of the 19th century by a lot of different Romantic figures. And so it's really hard to say kind of one clear definition of what romantic irony is. There are a lot of different varieties of it. It comes through in poetry. It's a kind of philosophical concept. It gets exercised through, I mean, look, the predecessors to the Jena Romantics, the early Romantics, are of course Goethe and Schiller, and they're thinking of Romanticism as a particularly aesthetic movement through poetry and drama, right? This is the source of the Sturm und Drang Romanticism. But what the early Romantics are trying to do with irony as a philosophical project, it's an epistemological project. They're thinking about different ways of knowing. So I think that's the important foundation for understanding what romantic irony is. But at least for Hegel, in this infamous attack on irony, he specifically focused on Friedrich Schlegel, August and Friedrich Schlegel, they're brothers, and they developed this notion of irony through several platforms like journals that they develop, and so it's becoming popular. And Hegel's response to it is just really intense. It's super heavy-handed, and he just goes full tilt into this nasty diatribe against it, but it's really directed at the Schlegel brothers and Friedrich Schlegel in particular. And he calls it absolute sophistry. He accuses them of being, sort of simple-minded dilettantes, of corrupting the very notion of irony, and even go so far as to call it a kind of an evil, right? There's a kind of a moral critique there as well. So that's the kind of debate. But I think where the conversation stands today is that a lot of scholars have looked at this and said, wow, that's really, really unfair of Hegel. If we take the time to look at what the Romantics actually said about irony, it's way more sophisticated than that. It's way more nuanced. There's a lot more interesting work being done there. And I want to say that analysis is right. I fully agree. It's a kind of heavy-handed, one-sided polemic against this concept that's way more interesting, goes way beyond Friedrich Schlegel, and so it deserves attention and it deserves some justification. The thing I want to do here is acknowledge all of that, and I think that's kind of where the discussion stands among scholars today. Is that let's vindicate the Romantics, and I fully agree we should do that. But there are a few elements in Hegel's critique that I think get overlooked because it's easy to say, "Wow, what was that diatribe?" Let's focus on the Romantics. I think Hegel is saying some things there that are actually really interesting about irony, about Romantic irony, but particularly that relate to some of the ways we think about irony today. And I think we think, well, what we're talking about irony today, that's very different. That's not the same thing when we talk about Romantic irony. That was a literary, philosophical thing, and that's not related to, when we talk about someone's mullet on the subway. That's a different thing, but I don't think it is. And I want to kind of draw that connection and rethink Hegel's critique as a way to get at what it is that we find kind of annoying about instances of irony, but at the same time also recognize what a powerful critical tool irony can be when done right. And it's that when done right part of it that I try to flesh out in the paper.
Yeah, awesome. And so it makes sense that Hegel in particular is really going to hate irony because irony involves saying something you don't mean, right? Whereas, as you pointed out, Hegel's all about meaning it, right? Like we are going to get to the state of absolute knowing where through human rationality, we can comprehend the totality of the universe. Right. And so he's very much moving way past Kant where no, there's this thing in itself that we can't understand. And so as you talk about in the paper, the Romantics and the Jena Romantics in particular, right, are moving toward the aesthetic as a way of attempting to get at the aspects of understanding the thing of it in itself, but really like through oblique means, through more obscure esoteric sort of ways, by through poetry, through metaphor, through flowery language, and through fiction, right, through lying in a sense, through not meaning it, in the terms of irony. And so it makes total sense that Hegel is gonna hate that. And so can we just briefly get at what is the value for the Jena Romantics and maybe the Schlegel bros in particular? What is the value of irony to them, and how do they conceive of its nature?
Good, yeah. So they see, again, to come back to this kind of post-Enlightenment mindset that they're in, what I think they have in common with Hegel is this idea of of going beyond thinking of subjectivity as something as limited to our rational agency, right? And okay, well, what else is there? And Hegel has a way of answering that. But for the Romantics, they particularly felt like there were ways of knowing that the Enlightenment and Kant in particular had overlooked. Well, I say that with some qualification because it's actually they look to Kant elsewhere to answer that question, particularly in the aesthetics. So, if the Romantics read the Critique of Pure Reason and they think, oh, okay, um, uh, there's this notion of subjectivity that is grounded in our ability to think rationally, right, about who we are and about our commitments, our moral character, and so forth. But then they look to the aesthetics and they're like, wait a second, there's this interesting notion of a free play of the faculties, right? There's this moment where we don't fully conceptualize what's going on. And that's super interesting. I wonder if we could think about subjectivity and the connection to our epistemic limits in terms of that kind of free play. And they want to take that and do what actually some of the proto-romantics did, like Schiller, and say, wow, let's go back to the aesthetics, the Critique of Judgment, and see if we can extract from that an account of aesthetic ways of experience. I don't know if they're ready to call it ways of knowing, but can we extract from that something that kind of gets us beyond rationality per se? Let's look to the kind of the margins of rationality and find those moments where it's not totally clear, where our experience isn't fully articulable. And so they look at moments like, they're fascinated with the limits of discursivity, whether that's in paradox or in a kind of multiplicity of meanings, or even incomprehensibility, right? They like this idea that we can't fully grasp everything, but we can come at it through the poetic. So you mentioned poetry, and that for them is the thing in the modern world. If we can't fully grasp the world through concepts, we have poetry to at least help us do something. And for them, the important thing is, and this is where the contrast with Hegel becomes really important, is that we don't get too fixed and settled in our way of thinking. And poetry is this way to kind of keep moving, right? So it's always, when they talk about irony, it's always in this language of motion, right? They talk about the parabasis. And the parabasis is interesting because in Greek drama, right, or Greek comedy, I guess more often, there's this moment, where you have certain characters or a chorus step out, break the fourth wall, and talk to the audience and let the audience know, oh, what you think is going on the stage is different from what's actually going on. And they tell you what's actually going on, right? So that notion of parabasis, or stepping out, and they talk to us, the audience, and give us a different picture than what the appearance is. So they're interested in the separation between appearance and reality, and they think of irony as this kind of parabasis, this kind of constant, like, wait a second. It's a form of skepticism. It's a way of keeping a bit of a distance from what's in front of us. And they like these moments because it keeps us a little bit on our toes and not get too fixed and firm in what we think about the world. And that's the way they saw what Hegel's project was doing, especially with absolute knowing, is that it was just this kind of almost this epistemological arrogance. And so what they claim to be doing is to be deconstructing that kind of self-assurance. And irony is the best way to do it. And poetry is the vehicle for us thinking ironically and taking an aesthetic approach to the world. We keep a bit of a distance from it, and we keep our commitments constantly in check.
Yeah, and that makes sense coming out of Schiller's influence in particular, right? Because he really takes this notion of free play and takes it as far, I think, as you possibly go. It becomes like radical freedom in almost like a Sartrean sense, right? Or I guess proto-Sartrean sense, right?
Yeah, and it has a political significance for Schiller as well.
Oh, absolutely, right. And so, then engaging in those moments of freedom where we don't fully conceptualize things, and we're sort of shifting and vacillating back and forth between disclosing but also enclosing or hiding, right? It makes sense in terms of expanding the boundaries of selfhood, or at least of subjectivity, in terms of like expanding freedom, expanding agency, comes not through like a full grasp and therefore domination of the world as maybe Hegel is thinking about it, which seems to be the case. Um, Certainly in terms of like his political readings. And more just like, no, it's like maintaining, as you pointed out, this deep thread of skepticism as a way not of like shrinking the self, but rather expanding the self through maintaining skepticism and, being able to like grow and shift along with the world itself, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's exactly right, and I think you articulated nicely that connection to subjectivity, because that's one thing that if we could talk about what Hegel's critique is more precisely, but the thing that I want to show is that the defenders of romantics are right to show that rich connection to subjectivity comes through that discussion of irony very clearly. This idea that we're exercising a form of freedom through this aestheticized skepticism towards the world, that we keep our options open, as it were, and that opens up more possibilities for us, right? The irony is valuable because it really forces us to think about what our commitments are, and in doing that, gain a deeper sense of the self. And I think that's one thing that Hegel really, really missed in his critique of irony, is that connection to a robust sense of subjectivity.
Yeah, awesome. So, what do you think Hegel gets right in his critique of romantic irony, right? So we touched on, you just touched on a big thing that you think he misses, which is the connection to subjectivity. But like, what are some of the things that he gets right in his critique of this view?
Yeah, good. You have to dig for it, and so that's kind of the labor of this project is to dig for it. So he says all kinds of things, and the heart of the critique is really focused in the lectures on aesthetics, and I think it's worth pointing out these lectures were published posthumously by one of his students, Heinrich Otto, who had his own axe to grind. So there are different theories about the authenticity of these lectures. Let's take them at face value, that right, Hegel's notes and his lectures said something along these lines, but you can find critiques of the romantics and irony in the philosophy of right and elsewhere. And of course, in the phenomenology of spirit is where he, without saying it explicitly, he calls the romantics evil. But in the lectures on fine art is really where the sustained critique is of romantic irony, and it's really scattered. It's kind of all over the place, and you're not really sure what exactly the critique is. It's in some places it sounds like what he's saying is that to adopt this ironic position of in the world is purely a kind of empty aesthetic posturing. So it's a kind of style without substance critique, that it's abstract and formal is what he calls it. And it's kind of similar to his critique of the categorical imperative in Kant, right? You get this kind of formula, but there's nothing to it. It's abstract and formal, right? In other places, though, and this is really where his his critique gets very, very heated and personal. It reads as a kind of ad hominem. He's basically calling Schlegel this kind of megalomaniac, egotistical brat, and that irony is his way to go around and make himself aloof and superior to others. And I don't owe you anything. I don't owe you an explanation. So it becomes very pointed in these kinds of critiques, right? So there's a lot of this, and it's a bit scattered. And these are the moments that a lot of critics will point to and saying, wow, Hegel is like way off base here. But there is something buried in there that he says that I think has some merit to it. And he says that he's not criticizing irony in itself. What he's criticizing is the use of irony that is nicht im Ernst. In German, it's like, you can translate it different ways, but he's basically saying that it's not earnest, that it's not irony itself, but it's the kind of disingenuous use of irony, the not being in earnest. That's what he's interested in. And so that's what I picked up on, is like, what is he saying there? Because then you start to see the critiques. You see versions of that appear in other critiques of romantic irony. This idea that it's not irony that Hegel's against. I mean, there are plenty of moments where he'll speak very glowingly of Socratic irony, and of course, Schlegel claimed to be developing a form of Socratic irony. And he also speaks to others. Solger, who was a friend of his, was also an ironist, and he's like mostly okay with that kind of irony, but it's this idea that irony is not being used in earnest. And so what I wanted to try to understand was, what could that mean? Because that felt like the kind of critique that we lodge against the use of irony in our contemporary critiques, right? So if you think about someone like David Foster Wallace, who was a really harsh critic of the kind of irony that he was seeing in literary circles from the 80s and 90s, what he's criticizing is a kind of lack of earnestness. It's maybe a little too harsh, but I think Hegel's onto something in saying that the use of irony in that disingenuous, not in earnest way, I think there we have a basis for at least understanding thick and thin versions of irony, good and bad uses of irony.
Yeah, so the thick version of irony, as you're talking about, is the type that is actually aimed at something. It has a purpose, whereas the thin is just like the empty posturing, right? And as you're pointing out, Hegel's basically accusing Schlegel of being a hipster, right? Of,
Yeah,
you know,
very
you
much
don't
so.
mean what you say, and there's nothing behind your lack of meaning, right? It's just pure ironic posturing for the sake of posturing, right? So it is like this sort of aestheticized in terms of like aestheticism, right? The art for art's sake, right? There's no deep meaning. It just values itself, right? And so I'm going to adopt an ironic posture just because it's valuable to adopt an ironic posture.
Yeah. Yeah, and you see that. I mean, Christine Wampole had a series of articles about irony today, and what it is that's annoying or worrisome about irony, and I think a lot of what she says tracks, or at least maybe a decade or 2 decades ago, where irony was being used as a kind of a like a defense mechanism almost, right? That you've got your kind of style that doesn't really commit you to anything. You kind of have a jokey, slightly sarcastic approach to everything that doesn't really clue anyone in as to what your actual commitments are. And it's a way of not really being vulnerable, or not really a way of exposing yourself to having to actually stand for something. And I think that that's a version of what Hegel was getting at, is that it's a kind of a weak move to be perpetually distanced from everything, whereas a robust form of irony would be one that creates meaning out of the negation of meaning. And so I think we start to get at what the difference is between that thick and thin when we think of irony as creating an abundance out of meaning from the negation of meaning. And that's what I'm trying to get at with that language of having substance, right? Substantial irony is using irony as a way to get us to see more in that thing that we're ironizing. And although he doesn't articulate it that way, I think it's a basis for getting at what some of those critiques that we encounter today of irony, like it's just kind of vapid or thin, and it's just sort of like almost performative, I guess is the word. And I wouldn't say that's not irony. Maybe there are limits where it's so thin that it just stops being irony and just devolves into sarcasm or cynicism or something related. But I think irony at its best is substantial, right? It's really getting us to understand more of the meaning by reversing its meaning or undoing or negating its meaning.
Yeah, right. Where it's empty posturing. Yeah, when it's done wrong, it's empty posturing. It's like deeply insincere, right? And you mentioned David Foster Wallace just now, and you do in the paper as well. And he's attacking both literary circles and television, right?
Yeah,
Where television in the 80s and 90s, and I feel like in that essay, he like sort of identifies like the rise of David Letterman as sort of like I could be misremembering. But it's like sort of that shift where like irony becomes king, and thinking about TV in the '90s, like Chandler from Friends, right? It is like irony, largely through sarcasm, right, as just a means of like deflecting and not letting people in, right, and thereby not disclosing anything through the use of it, other than like you don't want to be serious.
right.
Yeah. Which I think, relates to, as we mentioned a few times, like the critique of hipsters, right? It's just like, it's pure posturing, right? I have the mullet. Why? Because it looks stupid, right? I drink PBR. Why? Because it tastes bad, right? So by enjoying the thing is really a means of like mocking the thing.
Right.
And I don't know where to go beyond that, but I feel like that's how Hegel's conceiving of like Schlegel and the Romantics' conception of irony. And so, as you're pointing out, there's a misfire there because that's not how they're conceiving irony. But B, he's at least right that that's the wrong approach to irony, even if he's misattributing it to the Romantics.
Yeah, so I mean, I think if you look at like, if they're both saying that romantic or that irony is grounded in the Socratic dialogue, you look at those moments where you could easily read Socrates as just being a smartass, right? He's just cutting up with his interlocutors or whatever, but really what he's doing there is he's using the kind of absurdity of a situation. He's pointing to it and almost exaggerating it as a way of making a deeper point, right? So in the apology, when he's asked, well, what do you think your punishment for corrupting the youth should be? He says with a straight face, "Oh, I think I should get free meals at the Prytaneum, right? like I get a meal ticket to the cafeteria, and and it is pretty funny, right? But what he's getting at, what he's pointing to in that moment, is the underlying injustice that is embedded in Athenian society and all of the assumptions that lead to his accusation and conviction. And I think that when irony is done well, it's doing something like that. It's negating something, but it creates something positive from that negation. And I think that Hegel's critique of the Romantics, as well as sometimes David Foster Wallace, right, who's seeing the rise of this cultural phenomenon and really, really worried about it, and I think is a very insightful concern, but maybe overplays its hand a little bit. In that, right, if you're critiquing the kind of jostling of late night talk shows that David Letterman or otherwise, yeah, it can get a little snarky and sarcastic, and that can be a bit vapid. But you look at the kind of critical tool that late night comedy has come to be, right? That by making light of things, by pointing to absurdity, by exposing hypocrisy, that in a kind of a playful way where we keep a bit of a distance from just how serious it actually is, that's an effective critical tool. And I think that that's what irony does really well. And so I think it's worth pointing to what it is that Hegel gets right about irony when it's bad, because I think there are moments of irony that are really very useful at present for us that we might be losing, right? I feel like we are kind of getting a little too serious, right? We don't know how to laugh at or point to absurdity, or we're getting kind of caught up in the gravity of things, where irony could be really, really useful provided we could use it in more effective ways.
Yeah, I feel like I have at least three thoughts here. So let me just briefly talk through them. One is pointing to like late night comedy today, right? It makes sense that Colbert's being canceled right now. It makes sense that Jimmy Kimmel is taken off the air, right? However briefly it may have been, right? That these people are like the face of the resistance to fascism right now. So that's thought number one. Let's see if I remember the other ones. Oh, the uh, number two, and maybe I'll stop with this one. Is I think you're right that we're having a harder time laughing at things, right, and taking things uh, overly seriously, although of course things are extremely serious and we need to be taking them seriously. It's just a question of how does that manifest, right? In a humorless way or in a way that employs humor for, positive political ends. But I feel like the flip of that is if you're very online, right? Like just the memification of reality where nothing is taken seriously,
Yeah.
right? Where thinking about all of the JD Vance memes, right? And just this explosion and proliferation where like as soon as any political figure does anything, steps their foot in any particular, and into anything in any particular way, right? It's just meme after meme after meme after meme. And so I think like we're in this, moment where we need like a Hegelian synthesis, perhaps
Yeah.
between those two antitheses,
Yeah.
right? Where, there's a subset of people who are taking things way too seriously. And then you have like
Yeah.
online culture, which is more youth culture, which is like nothing is serious. It's borderline nihilistic and maybe rightfully so, given the
Yeah.
state of reality right now.
Yeah, no,
That's
I
what I
think
got.
that I think that's exactly right, and I think it is kind of working between those two extremes because in a political moment like this, um, either one of those seem like options, right? It's either opt in fully, right, and or and run the risk of kind of rage fatigue, or it's to like live with a perma smirk, right, online, right, in the kind of the snarky online culture that exists, that becomes a tempting option. And so a good irony, I think, is kind of triangulating between those. And I think that this idea of being grounded in substance is a good way to do that. So, there's a very, very fine line between irony and sarcasm. And just a touch beyond that is a kind of cynicism. And I feel like all of those are threats uh, for us that we face today. But I think, irony done well, I think about like the Portland protests. Um, right. There are various ways of protesting, but and there are very serious ways of protesting that lack any sense of irony or humor or whatever. Um, but when Portland was described as this kind of hotbed of criminal violence, and the response to that by dressing up in like animal costumes and furry costumes or whatever, I think is like the best form of irony there is, right? Because it's pointing to the absurdity, to the deep contradictions, to the hypocrisy of that moment, and using irony in a really effective way to generate more meaning out of that, right? So you can just protest that by showing peacefulness or whatever, but the way that the Portland protesters did that by dressing up, by making a spectacle of it, right? So it is a show. It is meant to be a kind of aesthetic response to that moment. But it's pretty damn clever too, because it's almost like it undermines the gravity of that moment. It points to it, but it also sucks it of its power. And I think that irony does that really, really well when it's done as a critical tool. That's what it does best. Is it kind of does a kind of a reverse move on that gravity, and makes it playful, or points to the seriousness of it by making it light, making it giving it some levity.
Yeah, right. And with the Portland case in particular, wearing an inflatable frog costume, right, as a way of like, really, are we that dangerous? Right?
Yeah,
Like, this is a third world like hellscape that we're
yeah.
we're in, the New York of the why am I blanking on this? The Charles Bronson movies, Death Wish series, right? Like that's like the picture of Portland that like a
Right.
certain segment of U.S. society has, and like those the Death Wish movies are radically different if they're people in inflatable frog costumes, right? It's like hard to take seriously
Right.
as a threat. And I think too, there's a deep element of camp to it, and camp done well. And you and I were talking about this prior to recording, right? Like the Sontag's seminal account of camp, which is great in all sorts of ways, fails to register the political dimension of camp. And when I think of camp, and like the clearest examples of camp for me are like pride parades
Hmm.
and drag,
Yeah.
right? And there it's playful, it's theatrical, it's dramatic, it's exaggerating gender performance. It's unserious, but it's pointing to something deeply serious, and it stems out of a response to a particular form of oppression. And I think that's, precisely what you're saying with respect to positive uses of irony. Thick, substantive, earnest uses of irony are of the same sort. And of course, camp is ironic to its core in a certain sense, right? But I feel like Sontag has almost like the Hegelian notion of irony, which is like unserious. It's being witty for the sake of being witty. It's sort of taking Oscar Wilde as the paradigm while failing to situate him historically and politically.
Oh yeah, I totally agree with you. I mean, you would allow that there are forms of camp that are just kind of relishing in the theatrical, in the exaggerated, right? And so I think in that sense, Sontag gets that right. This notion of failed seriousness, that we can appreciate the kind of the gaudy and the tacky, and I think that camp is more along those lines. But I think that you're right that a blind spot for her is recognizing just how um, just how important those moments can be as political, as a kind of political critique. And she famously says that camp is apolitical, and I think you're right to point to examples where camp at it in its best forms are responding to moments and using that kind of exaggerated theatricality as a way of drawing attention to something broader. And I think that's exactly right. And I would actually put camp and romantic irony very, very similar together. I mean, they're certainly in the same sort of conceptual neighborhood, in that they're both kind of distanced aesthetic approaches to the world. And I think that they're both kind of, they're like forms of negating or accepting of of a kind of accepting of something that we might not um, appreciate otherwise. But I think that that idea that if we can see those as moments that point to underlying issues, then they're done particularly well. And I think that that kind of puts them conceptually closer together.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one aspect of your account that I want to talk about before we finish that we haven't gotten to yet, maybe we can relate it back to the camp connection, maybe not, is this notion of accountability,
Yeah.
right? Which sort of stems, I think, from the earnestness condition on irony, is that not really meaning it doesn't thereby excuse you from saying or doing whatever the hell it is you want to say or do,
Right.
right? That this is socially situated and culturally situated and morally situated, right? There's a normative element, I guess, is the point here. And so, can you talk us through that idea?
Sure. Well, I think you pointed to one of the crucial elements that we want to emphasize in this account. I mean, you could think of irony as a private affair. Richard Rorty does this, and or he doesn't say that it necessarily is. I think he's saying that it probably should be. Right? This is a way, if you take romantic irony as this kind of way to aesthetically distance yourself from your commitments so you can work through them, so that you can sort of maintain a kind of a critical distance from them, then great, you do that. But I think Rorty's wrong to say that it shouldn't be, because I think irony is inherently a social phenomenon, and I think that the fact that we're ironic with one another, that there's this kind of intersubjective component to it, that it comes with these norms. So unless we think that irony just means, well, all bets are off, right? You can say or do anything now. And then the interesting question comes, well, okay, well, what are the normative parameters that we work with socially to make irony effective? And right, so being substantive is, I think, one of them, right? There's something, if irony is a negative tool, right, a form of negation, there's something to be negated, right? And that we generate more meaning out of negating that meaning. So that's one way to do it. But then the bigger issue is that there's still a question of accountability there. There's still a question of owning up to that critical gesture of negating meaning. And that you don't get to say, oh, well, I was just being ironic. In the same way that you couldn't say, that you wouldn't say that a racist joke is not racist just because it was a joke. I think we have to talk about irony as not being a kind of normative anarchy just because we're talking ironically, right? So then what are those expectations? And this is the sense in which I talk about irony being grounded in its substance, that you don't get to sort of back off your commitments, that ultimately what irony is doing is pointing us to a deeper commitment, right? That it is pointing us to something that we actually, something that we will actually defend, some position that we actually maintain. And that if it is strictly a defensive mechanism, if it's strictly something that allows us to kind of keep everything in play without showing our cards, as it were, to others, then it's doing something. It's not living up to what irony can do. So I think it's actually self-defeating if what it means is you're absolved of all commitments. And so I think the very social character of irony means that ultimately we're held accountable for the kinds of critiques that we make through irony.
Yeah, I really like the idea that we, in employing ironically effectively, you're going to be able to back it up, right? If you're called out on it versus the person who makes the inappropriate joke, right? And who says, I was just joking, as if that absolves me of, any wrongdoing, right? It just, oh, I didn't mean it. Well, there are better and worse ways of not meaning it, is your point, I think, which seems exactly right.
That's right. And I think the difficulty that I have in saying that is the sense that ultimately irony has to get out of the way to some sort of discursive justification. And I worry about that the idea that owning up to it means stepping out of the ironic space and owning up it, like, okay, well, ultimately discursive explanations prevail when push comes to shove, and your irony, gets to that point where the normative parameters of it are in question, that we have to kind of step out of irony. And I'm not sure the romantic ironists would be willing to admit that, but I don't know that it means that we actually have to own up or articulate an explanation. But I think it does mean that we have to own our irony in some some strong sense.
Yeah, I like that point, and I think you're absolutely right that it's not going to just give way to, well, here's what I meant, right?
Right,
In the
right.
way that, like, oh, you didn't understand my joke. Well, let me explain
Explain
all
it
the
to you.
background conditions that you needed in order to have understood it, right? I think you're absolutely right. We don't want to go there, in the same way that, if you don't understand a metaphor, like I may be able to like gesture toward the meaning of the metaphor, but like
Right.
that's not how metaphors function in terms of like, well, there's a clear like discursive paraphrase we can use and then boom, we got it, right? Here's the
Yeah.
literal meaning, right? There,
Yeah.
there there's always, for good metaphors, there's always more there worthy of unpacking. Similar, and that's like the Kantian point with like the free play of the imagination with the understanding is that there's always more to unpack. And so it's not that like concepts are just inapplicable, if I could talk, right? But rather that like, no, we can always throw more concepts at the thing and the thing outstrips our ability to conceptualize it, which I think is the point you're saying here with irony done
Yeah.
well. Yeah, we need to own it and be, take ourselves to be accountable for it and apologize when we do it poorly. But not like give a full explanation there. Everyone's like, oh yeah, that I
Right.
get it now.
Yeah, yeah, because then you could just imagine, there's Hegel. Hegel pops his head into the picture and he says, "See, I told you so." At the end of the day, everything's going to have to be conceptually articulable. See, I was right. But no, I think that, there's more to be said about what it means to that the substance of irony is grounded. But I do think that there is that at least that's the idea there is this idea of being responsible for that negative gesture of irony, that you own up to it, whether that's conceptually explained or otherwise. There is this sense of like some degree of normativity built into romantic irony when it's done well.
Yeah, otherwise it's just hipster posturing.
Yeah, yeah, that's what you don't want.
Exactly. Awesome. So I think we'll leave it there. So Jay, thank you so much for joining me. This was an absolutely terrific discussion.
Well, thank you for having me. I enjoyed it very much.
Awesome.